Why are there so many medieval paintings of knights fighting snails? Or being chased by giant rabbits? Or riding fish? Was this medieval humor? Some sort of religious symbolism? Or were the artists just, bored out of their minds? Today, we're diving into the weirdest corners of medieval art to answer one bizarre question. Just why were medieval people being attacked by rabbits and snails? Most of these odd creatures live in the margins, literally. They're part of what's called Marginalia, illustrations scribes sometimes added in the empty borders of manuscripts. Usually, the main text was religious or scholarly, but the margins, that's where things got unhinged. Dancing monkeys, trumpet butt people, killer rabbits, and snail duels, all lovingly painted next to Holy Scripture. But why? First, let's acknowledge something. Medieval people had a sense of humor. A very weird one, but it was there. Many of these illustrations were jokes, inside jokes between scribes. Think of it like medieval meme culture. A bit of absurdity to break up the monotony of copying the Psalms for the 400th time. And yes, some artists were probably just trying to mess with future readers. Mission accomplished. The snail, though, is something special. Knights are always fighting them, but the snail never attacks. It just sits there. And the knight? He's terrified. Scholars have debated this for centuries. Some say the snail represented cowardice, others, the slow but inevitable approach of death. Another theory? The Lombards, a medieval group hated by the church, were mocked in art as snails. Or maybe the snail was just a stand-in for something unstoppable, no matter how brave the knight. And then there are the rabbits. But these aren't cute, fluffy bunnies. These rabbits are armed and angry. They chase, stab, and execute people. Why? This is what's called world-turned upside-down imagery, common in medieval humor. A rabbit defeating a hunter, a snail scaring a knight. It's all about flipping expectations. Satire, absurdity. Some see it as mocking the nobility, like, even a bunny could beat this guy. Not every image had a deep meaning. Sometimes, the artist was just bored. Imagine spending months copying a Bible by hand, in a cold stone room with no breaks. You draw something weird too. In fact, Marginalia may have been an early form of creative freedom for scribes, a chance to express themselves, or just blow off steam. So what do killer rabbits and giant snails really mean? Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. But they remind us that medieval people weren't always serious. They laughed, they joked, and sometimes they doodled absurd monsters in the margins of holy books, just because they could. So, the next time you see a medieval knight being stabbed by a rabbit, don't ask what it means. Just enjoy the fact that even in the Middle Ages, people were weird. And if you like this medieval madness, check out my other videos on peasant life, hygiene, and the summer that nearly killed Europe. Here's a man getting a sword through his skull. And here's someone else calmly being disemboweled. No screaming, no flinching, just mild concern. So, what was going on? Were medieval people just built different? Or is this another case of artistic weirdness that's stranger than it seems? If you've ever browsed through a medieval manuscript, and let's be honest, who hasn't, you might have noticed something a bit off. People are constantly getting stabbed, beheaded, or devoured by rabbits, and yet their expressions rarely change. No pain and no terror. Sometimes they even look a little bored. What gives? Let's get one thing straight. Medieval artists weren't going for realism. Manuscript art was symbolic, not emotional. The goal wasn't to show how something felt, but to show what it meant. Take martyrdom scenes, for example. The calm expression on a dying saint wasn't an oversight. It was intentional. It meant they were spiritually ready, serene, even triumphant. Pain and fear, that was for sinners. Another reason? Faces were basically copy-pasted. Monks and scribes often weren't trained artists. They were working with limited tools, tight margins, and a deadline. You didn't need a pain face or fear face or being eaten by snails face. You just needed a face. Which is how you end up with this poor guy, who looks like he's thinking about lunch while being stabbed in the liver. But there's a darker angle too. Death was everywhere in the Middle Ages. Plague, famine, war, childbirth, you name it. The average medieval person saw death not as a shocking twist, but as something, well, inevitable. So maybe it's not that people didn't feel fear, they just didn't expect anything else. Of course, some of it is just plain absurd. Marginalia, those weird little doodles in the margins of manuscripts, often show things such as rabbits firing arrows or stabbing knights. Some historians think this was a kind of medieval meme culture, scribes amusing themselves after hours of copying text. So, if you see a decapitation where no one seems to mind, it might not be symbolism or realism. It might just be the medieval version of, thank goodness it's Friday. So, no, medieval people weren't emotionless robots, but their art had a different job to do, and expressing raw human pain just wasn't part of the brief. In fact, the next time you see a saint being boiled alive with the expression of someone waiting for the bus, remember, to the medieval mind, how you died mattered less than why. Medieval stories were full of weird creatures. Men with no heads, creatures with faces in their chests, dog-headed warriors who barked like hounds, but carried swords. These weren't fairy tales. They were listed in travelogues, described in encyclopedias, and illustrated on maps. And the strangest part? Medieval people really believed these monsters were real, and living just beyond the edge of the known world. So what were they seeing? What did these creatures represent? And why did medieval Europe fill its maps with monsters? Let's take a look. In the Middle Ages, maps weren't just about geography. They were about theology, fear, and imagination. Most European maps put Jerusalem at the center. The world was a circle, divided into 3 parts: Europe, Asia, and Africa. But the outer edges? That's where things got weird. Unknown lands meant unknown peoples. And in a time before science or satellite imagery, that meant monsters. Enter the monstrous races, beings that blurred the line between natural and supernatural. They weren't just fantasy, they were part of how medieval people explained the diversity of creation. Let's meet a few. The Blemii were headless men. Their faces were in their chests, all where the sternum should be. They show up in Roman texts, but the Middle Ages took the idea and ran with it. Writers like Isidore of Seville included them in encyclopedias. Later, they were depicted on maps of Africa or India, anywhere far enough that no one could fact-check. Were they real? Of course not. But they meant something. To medieval Europeans, the Blemii represented the idea that even the most bizarre-looking people were still part of God's creation, just a bit further removed from civilization. Then there was the Cynocephali, dog-headed people. According to some texts, they lived in India. Others placed them in Africa or Asia Minor. They barked instead of speaking, hunted in packs, and were described in surprising detail by travelers like John of Mandeville and even St. Augustine. But here's where it gets weirder. Some medieval stories claimed they were Christian. That's right. There are depictions of dog-headed monks and even dog-headed saints. Because the real question wasn't what they looked like, it was whether they had souls. And in many versions, they did. which made them strange, but still redeemable. Another favourite? The skyopods. One-legged creatures with a giant foot that they used like an umbrella. Practical? No, but in the medieval imagination, entirely plausible. And then there were the lands themselves. Some maps included whale islands, massive beasts mistaken for land that sank ships when they lit fires on their backs. Again, this wasn't just artistic flair. It was a way to say, we don't know what's out there, so it could be anything. But why did people believe these things? Part of it was simple. They had no way to verify what lay beyond the mountains, deserts, or oceans. But it wasn't just ignorance. It was about morality. The farther you got from Christendom, the stranger and more dangerous people became. These monsters represented the unknown. But they also tested the boundaries of faith. Could someone look like a beast and still be saved? Could a barking warrior worship Christ? The farther you travelled from the familiar spires and marketplaces of Christendom, the more the world seemed to twist into something otherworldly. Beyond the edges of the map lay places where people spoke in tongues no one at home could understand, where the air shimmered with heat, and where, at least according to the manuscripts, the locals might have faces in their chests, or a single foot big enough to shade them from the sun. To a medieval mind, these weren't just tall tales. They were warnings. They were the embodiment of the unknown, a reminder that beyond the comfort of the parish church, the rules of the world, and perhaps even the rules of God, might be different. And so came the questions. If a man looked like a beast, could he still be saved? If a warrior barked like a dog but knelt before the cross, would Christ still hear his prayer? In the medieval imagination, monsters didn't just live at the edge of the map. They lived at the edge of faith. It wasn't just about what existed. It was about what was possible in a world made by God. To us, these creatures seem absurd. But to medieval minds, they were a way of mapping not just the world, but humanity itself. A way of saying, we know who we are because we know who we're not. And maybe the monsters they feared say more about them than about anything that might have lived beyond the edge of the map.